My name is Stuart Ellis. I'm the founder and chief executive officer for a company called Charter School Capital. We are an organization that for the last decade has been solely dedicated to funding, financing, and guiding charter schools across the country. Over the last decade, we've invested over $1.5 billion in more than 550 charter schools, educating more than 650,000 kids. And while we're proud of what we've done, frankly, I haven't taught a single kid during that period. You all have been doing that. The experts with me today are here to guide you through some of the issues and challenges associated with facilities for your charter school organization. I'm really excited to have Mike Morley, Kevin Lynch, and Michelle Lynch with us today. And I'm going to have them walk through and share their backgrounds with you. But I think you'll find that you're sitting here looking at a panel of leading developer, leading real estate brokerage, and one of the leading experts on regulatory environment and some of the programs out there to support charters. And I'm excited to have them all with you. So with that, Mike, you want to share your background?
Sure. We've been a family business for a number of years. In fact, started in 1980 when we started a construction company, and from there began to develop a lot of government projects. In 2002, I was elected to the legislature in Utah and was in some education meetings and learned about a new thing called the charter school. It was just introduced, or very recently had been introduced in the market in Utah. And I was intrigued from a policy standpoint about charter schools. Thought they were really cool, and visited a number of them that were in very poor facilities, but seemed to be outperforming many of their counterparts in the district. And strictly from a policy standpoint, I thought, how can we help proliferate this movement to allow choice in education? And so in 2004, we used a model that we had developed, or at least been involved in, with government leaseback facilities, and put out an RFP for a school and built a school in Draper, Utah, which was one of the first ones that we had been involved with. It was a tremendous success, and the next year we did 4 more, and the next year we did 4 more, and the bonding folks thought we were nuts taking that kind of risk with new startup schools, but it was a wonderful experience for us, and it was a great success. My children are still in charter schools, or at least the ones that are still in school. But it was a great opportunity, and so we founded American Charter Development. And since that time, we've done 70 or so schools and invested about $500 million in the opportunity of charter schools. And philosophically, we are very excited about charter schools, but we as a family business, I have 9 children, and 6 of them voluntarily work with us, and 3 that are still in high school involuntarily work. But it's been a great experience for us to get involved with kids and education. It's something that we're very passionate about, as well as something that we're skilled at, which is finance and construction of facilities for charters.
Thanks, Mike. Kevin?
My name is Kevin Lynch. I work at Cushman, Wakefield. We're the largest privately held commercial real estate platform in the country. I help schools and developers with site selection, acquisition, dispositions, and leasing for charter school facilities pretty much across the country. And I've been doing it for about 10 years now.
Michelle?
Good morning. Michelle Lynch. I'm the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the California Charter Schools Association. I've been there about 6 years now. Advocate for California charter schools before about 20 federal and state agencies, a lot of which do the facilities work in California. Also advocate before the legislature, running some bills at the state level for facilities.
Thanks. So we're going to walk through some of these issues listed up here on the agenda, talk about what's going on in the market for facilities, real estate side of charter schools, addressing some of the challenges of balancing the dreams for what you'd like in a facility with the budget realities. Understanding and choosing amongst various funding structures. A decade ago, there were very few ways to finance or get money for your charter school. Today, there are many more options. Some of them are really complicated and hard to access. Some of them are easier access. Some of them are more expensive. Some of them are less expensive. But there are a lot of issues around that go beyond cost, qualification, and the complexity of the structure. We'll talk through some of that. The funding approval is, from an underwriting standpoint, similar across all those options. We'll address some of those issues. And throughout the conversation, and we hope it is a conversation, please feel free to ask questions or raise your hand, and we'll try to address them as we go. And at the end, the four of us will be around afterwards if we get deep into something that seems like it's unique to your situation. We're happy to talk about that offline. As we do go through the materials, just a note, the presentation is available for download afterwards, and you can share it with others at the link sitting up here. So you don't have to feel like you have to do some screenshot as we go through things. The entire thing and all the materials are there. And in fact, I think that we're live streaming on Facebook, so you can also see it afterwards or have other people join and see a video of the session today later on in the conference if you'd like to share it with someone. So with that, one other thing, everybody's contact information is included in the presentation. So if you want to contact any of the four of us afterwards, you have access to that too. With that, a high-level comments on what's going on in the market today. If you looked at things some years ago, in fact, when Charter School Capital started, there were 1.2 million kids being educated at 3,000 charter schools across the country. Today, there are 3 million kids a decade later educated at 7,000 charter schools across the country. And there are more than 1 million on waiting lists. The biggest challenge to expansion and getting a lot of those kids off the waiting list is generally the lack of space, not the willingness of your program to address them or the availability of teachers to teach them, but the physical space to accommodate the demand that we all have for charters. Today, there are more financing options than ever before, and we'll talk through some of those as we go through here. But that said, there is more money. It doesn't mean it's easy to access or get to, but there is more money available for charter schools than ever before. And more creative options for your schools. We'll touch on that as we go. Although the market for money is cheaper than it's been, if you looked at averages over the last 50 years, in the last year or two, costs of money everywhere have been rising. So, when you read things about the Fed raising rates, et cetera, financing your charter school today is probably 1% to 2% on an annualized basis, higher than it was just a year or two ago. That's despite the fact that more money is available and more money is flowing into the space, but still rates in general have been rising. That may have implications for whether you should be thinking about or might want to think about refinancing anything or locking in some long-term program. We're going to get into some of these things in more detail. Thinking about the options for your situation are going to be unique depending on whether you're a first-year charter school or you're 10 years in, or you're opening your 25th school in your whole network, or you're an independent program, or you focus on just special needs kids, or you have English as a second language program, or you're in one state or another. All those things are issues to consider. There are a lot of different options available. We'll touch on that. And then trends in the real estate market in your local area matter. So with that at a high level, and before Michelle drops into talking about some of the federal programs, you guys want to comment on the overall state of the market? Kevin, fire.
Schools are obviously having a lot of challenges. The economy is recovered for all sectors right now, and the hurdles that schools have to go through from a permitting zoning standpoint have put an added burden on the school leaders trying to find space, especially in core markets. So we're starting to see a little bit of a flattening out in some of the core markets, such as the Bay Area, San Francisco, LA, starting to kind kind of flatten out from a rent standpoint. So hopefully over the next 12 to 18 months, there'll be a little bit more vacancy in the market, more options for schools. And it's extremely competitive. I know many schools are trying to open right now and get in at the same time, but with such a tight inventory, it's just increasingly competitive to try and find space. So you just gotta work through your process as best you can and try and find sites that are functional for schools.
Thanks. We're finding very similar situations in charter schools are a creature of states. And so every state is a little different and has a little different nuances to deal with. We're in California, costs of ground are so high that new construction is very difficult to achieve. Areas such as Michigan or even some of the other Midwestern states, ground is still fairly inexpensive, and so costs for construction are not astronomical. There's always opportunities, or at least many times opportunities in markets where there may have been some depressed real estate to buy a big box store or buy some real estate and renovate. Those oftentimes provide opportunities for low-cost facilities that, with good design and innovation, can provide a good solution for schools. So it really is regionally based and depends a lot on what's happening in your local markets. But just as financing opportunities have never been greater, also opportunities for renovation, for buying new property and ground up construction have never been greater. And it's a balancing act as we try to match what the schools can afford, backing into what's available and trying to meet a balance that will meet your academic and curriculum needs as well as your wants with your budget. And so that's always been the kind of balancing act that we've had to deal with development of charter schools.
I'm happy to see that the room's standing room only, but I do have a question for all of you. How many of you are running charter schools or actually involved directly with the program? By show of hands, how many are actually leading charter schools today? And how many of you in the room are vendors or support services for charter schools themselves? And how many of you just felt like coming because you thought we were really good looking? Or none. Okay, so we covered the first two. All right, as we go through this, some of the things that we're talking about are relevant to you if you're a charter school leader, and others may be more critical to the advisory team that you may have around you as you enter into some of these projects. That said, I think we'd like to spend a little bit of time around some of the regulations and program opportunities that are out there, and Michelle's going to touch on that.
So public financing for facilities is really mainly done at the state level. There are a couple of federal programs that cover facilities. There's the Credit Enhancement Grant. It's exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, it's enhancing your credit. So if you go in for private capital, this grant will then give you an extra bit of money to basically enhance that credit and make your credit rating better for that capital. This is something that is sub-granted out, so it's granted to entities from the federal level, and then that's sub-granted out in California. It's granted to our treasurer's office. There are other private entities in other states that also sub-grant that out. There wasn't an application actually open until recently. It just closed, and there's $16 million available for that program. It goes pretty far, actually, $16 million. So check to see if there's any entity in your state that has that available. It's a really good opportunity. The other program is the Charter School Facility Incentive Grant. This is a fantastic program. It's not very large, though. There was only, I think, about 13 million available in the past, and only a couple of states have actually accessed it. It basically provides reimbursement for a lease. So if you're leasing a private facility, then you can come in and get a reimbursement per pupil for that lease. It's used a lot in California. Again, it's really great. It can cover almost all of, I think, about 75% of your lease costs. So that's really it at the federal level, unfortunately. But there are a lot of state programs. A really really great resource to find if your state has any programs is the Charter School Facilities Initiative. So with that, like 16 states have per pupil grants, 16 states have specific charter school facility programs, 12 states have charter school facility loan programs, 7 states basically give equal access to their traditional public school facility programs to charter schools, and then 5 states provide charter schools with access to local property tax dollars. That's huge. We don't have that in California, and I would say that would be a massive help. So those 5 states actually are probably a great environment for charter school facilities.
Where can people get that information you were just mentioning?
Yeah, the Charter School Facilities Initiative, if you just Google that, they partner with the National Charter School Association, and they've got all of that information. They've got a great report. And if you want to come talk to me afterwards, I can tell you what states have each of those as well.
Anything else? We'll roll.
That's about it.
All right. So everybody's so concerned about, who's going to be president, what happens at the federal level. We just said there's $29 million available for the entire country. That's a big change. It's a big deal what happens at the federal level. Everything is done at the state and local level. And despite what the news would have us all know, that's where it occurs. That said, Mike, you touched on earlier the balance between what we can afford and what's required. You want to walk through some of the things and talk about some of those aspects?
Sure. Well, when we start working with schools, and obviously a new startup school is going to be different than a well-seasoned school that has a solid track record. But in the case of new schools, for example, we're looking at what they can afford in the initial year, and obviously that's the most risky year, and that's what most will say, is that becomes the area where it's most difficult to get the funding. And so basically we're not going on data that is seasoned or off audited financial statements. We're going on performance, we're going on your projections. And so we're looking at doing demographics on the area to make sure that there are adequate students in the area to support your programs. We're looking for the reason why you believe that school is going to be successful. We're looking at different board members and expertise of the board and diversification of the board and those kinds of things as we underwrite a new school. And then we look at a conservative enrollment projection. And from that projection, we can extrapolate based on the state and federal funds that are available, how much you would likely get in state and federal funds. And then we back into what you can afford for facilities. Kind of as a rule of thumb, we look at 20% as a maximum of what you can afford of your overall funding to support facilities. Any more than that, and we believe that it's very difficult for you to run the programs, pay teachers, get the curriculum, and do the other things that you need to do. So we kind of back into a budget for facilities, and from that, we can determine based on rates of interest that we can acquire capital, how much you can afford for a facility, and then we go to work looking for a solution that fits that budget. It may be ground up, it may be a remodel, it may be kind of a combination of both, where you're able to buy a facility and add on to it, and may even have some modular components based on what the ability of the school to pay for the facilities are. First year is always hard because you're buying the property, you're doing the permitting and all of that. And every state's different. Some states are very favorable in their charter school laws towards development of facility. Others, you have to go through the same process and permitting and zoning requirements as any other commercial project. So it really is state and locally specific to your needs. We're happy to visit with you, or any other qualified group would be happy to, I'm sure, try to walk you through those issues. But from that metrics, whether you're a seasoned school, now seasoned schools may be able to qualify for a little better rate based on their performance. and their past performance. There are always opportunities. I know that CSC has worked with us on projects that are seasoned and have taken out previous construction financing and other things and been able to help in a lower cost solution for schools that have that opportunity to then, that have made it and kind of passed the muster from the beginning through the first couple of years of operations.
We welcome all charter schools. I don't know what he's talking about.
As Michelle said, there's other opportunities, in different states like Colorado and Utah and others who have basically a obligation or a state moral obligation component to help schools get better rates on bond funding when they get seasoned. If they can meet a certain criteria, then with the state moral obligation, they're able to get better rates. So be aware of what's available to you because it's specific to each state, and it makes a big difference depending on where you are.
Kevin, you look like you had something on that.
Yeah, kind of piggyback off that, the total project cost when you guys are looking through the scope of work, because a lot of these projects are adaptive reuse, and a lot of these projects you use lease rate and trying to get a landlord to amortize on top of that for your scope of work, for your TIs, to get your occupancy levels, permitting, zoning, charter school capital. They're good at buying facilities for charter schools, bringing on the right people to put together TIs, project management, fund it, and kind of have zero out of pocket for the schools and take on all that risk on the front end of the project and amortizing it back in lease rate. So when you're looking at projects, look at lease, look at sale, and then look at total project cost. What is it going to cost for you to do an adaptive reuse to bring a building into a functional setting for your school and your students?
Mike mentioned, and Kevin just referred to it also. We'll answer your question just one second. Up here, I just wanted to explain what this is. We've tried to simplify the how much can I afford, and Mike mentioned earlier looking at a metric of not more than 20% of your annual revenues in terms of your expenditures on your facility. That doesn't really matter whether it's your lease payment or principal and interest or any. It's the payment to access your facilities. He mentioned 20%. A good way to calculate how much you can afford in a facility, ballpark, is using this kind of chart here. What you see is along the vertical axis over there, you have the potential project budget going from 0 to 20 million. And then across the bottom, the horizontal axis, you can see starting at $0 of revenue a year going up to 10 million a year. Those three different diagonal lines look at a target of 10% facilities cost as a percentage of revenue. The middle line, the gray line, is 15%, and the green line is 20%, which Mike mentioned as a kind of top end. In states like Michigan or Ohio, most programs are running at well less than 20% rent to revenue, so you can do and probably get approved for something as high as 20% of revenue spent on facilities. But that means that you have less money than the alternatives in the area that you're spending on teachers, programs, curriculum, et cetera. So in the end, all of this is, hey, how do I access, space that is unique and sufficient for the program that you are running, and do it in a way that's affordable to ensure the program's success. What this shows is if you were a school that had $4 million in revenue a year, let's say, that says you can afford approximately, depending on what target you're looking at 10% rent to revenue or debt service to revenue versus 20%, you'd be able to afford a project that was between $4 and $8 million. So if the decision you need to make is how much of my annual income do I want to spend on facilities. Once you have that, this gives you a pretty good idea of the project you can fund, regardless of how you're financing it. And it just is a guideline. So if you have an architect come in and say, hey, I can, design you a building and it'll only cost $12 million. If you had $4 million a year, you would immediately look at this and say, I'm not going to be able to afford that. Can you do it for half? And actually, the answer usually is yes, you can do it for half. You just get less, or maybe you get less gold leaf, or maybe you can't have leather, in the gym. Maybe you can't have a gym, but those challenges. This at least provides some simplistic guideline for how to figure out approximately what your organization can afford. Any other question?
I was just wondering, Mike, could you explain how your company works with charter schools, like what the cost is to the charter? Is it like a turnkey? How do you work with the charter school specifically to develop their school and then turn it over to them? And what is the cost to them?
The cost to them up front, because they're new schools, we know they don't have funds, so our program is set up so that it doesn't have any upfront costs. The costs will all be formula based on a rent based on the cost of the facility or total project costs. So there would be no cost to the school as we get in and underwrite. Once we select the school and qualify the school and the board, at that point, then we would move forward on our own costs or funds and work with the school in developing a program for them and a facility for them. And they would not be responsible for paying anything until they were able to start generating revenue through through the state and through their enrollment. And oftentimes we'll even delay a little bit the beginning month or two in order to allow the school to obtain a little bit of revenue and get a little bit of a cushion before rents become due. So it really depends on the school. We really do try to partner with the schools in a way that works for them, and we look at their budgets and try to make it as seamless as possible for the school.
So is it a loan to the school and then a consultant fee that you're, what is
We've
it?
done it through loans. Typically, we do it as a purchase and lease back with an option to purchase the facility once the school is seasoned and able to access other forms of capital. So it can be a long-term lease, it can be a short-term lease, but typically, in order to secure our funds, we usually own the real estate, at least for startup schools. In more seasoned schools, we've come in as subordinate finance, we've come in other ways as well. But for startup schools, typically to secure ourselves, we come in as the landlord and provide a lease structure for the school, and then provide them an opportunity to purchase at that time.
And the lease pays all of your financing costs
Yes.
and a fee.
Yes.
Let's actually talk about or broaden that.
Right.
The up here on chart up that you see is a framework as a way to think about what kind of options are available for your school depending on which stage of development you are. And there are two factors listed on here. One is, if you look again at the horizontal axis, number of years of operation. And this is a framework, so it's not year by year or anything like that. But number of years of operations on the horizontal axis, and on the vertical axis, the size of the financing. I want to be clear, that's different from the size of your school. So it's not 100 kids versus 1,000 kids. In the case of the size of the financing, what matters to the market is, are you funding 1 million, 10 million, 100 million? Because at 100 million, believe it or not, there are many more options for schools than there are at 1 million. Similarly, the options increase as you go out in terms of numbers of years of the maturity of your program. So if you're in year 10 and you've got a $50 million financing, you will have people crawling all over themselves and all over you and your organization to provide money. If you're a $2 million deal for a year 0 or year 1 school, you can stand out in the street corner with your sign up and people will keep driving by and nobody will stop to talk to you. That said, depending on where you're at on this matrix, I kind of want to talk about there are different options available for everybody at any stage. So if you look at the lower left quadrant where it says short-term lease, long-term lease developer, that is a small financing. And In this case, that center line we've pegged at between $7 and $10 million, the financing. Let's just use 10 million as a ballpark. And then number of years of operation, although the bottom says 0 to 10, think about that center line, the dividing line, as the first charter renewal you receive, whether that's year 3 or year 5 or whatever. Once you are renewed, the market views you very differently than prior to getting your first renewal. So in that lower left box, those that are the smallest deals and the riskiest deals in terms of their maturity, there are options, and those are where most charter schools start. Local landlords, you go into a church school that was empty for a couple of years, you get some office building or something that the landlord renovates because it's been empty. You get a short-term lease with somebody who really isn't thinking about you as a long-term tenant. And frankly, you may not be thinking about it as space you really want to be in forever. That's one option. That's available to smaller deals, early stage. The second is long-term lease. Mike mentioned this earlier. It used to be 5 to 10 years ago, there were really not long-term lease options available to charter schools. But as more and more charters have been established over a longer time frame, more people use charters as a stable tenant who could be there long-term. As a result, there are people and pools of capital out there that will invest in funding your charter school at the long haul. And while they do it in the form of a lease, it still works out as potentially 100% financing. You just start paying your monthly rent and you don't have to put in anything up front. So the question we just had up here about Mike's program, about consulting fees and all of that, he said there's none of that. It's just built into the long-term transaction. There is an example. And the parties that are providing the most of this to early stage schools are developers like Mike's organization. So there are a number of developers all across the country that will take the risk and invest in building out your school or getting you launched. They have access to all different types of money, including things like the EB-5 program, which is really foreign money, foreign investment capital coming in. It provides some low-cost access. It's too complex for an individual school to access, but for developers like American Charter Development and others, they have large pools of capital, and your school can be one of those. And so that is now increasingly an alternative. If you look up at the upper right-hand side, I'd say those are the most mature, largest organizations. So these are, here we said more than a $10 million deal, but let's say, it's a $20 million transaction, and it's a school that's already been renewed once. There you have access to still long-term lease programs. You also have access to bank financing, where if you have the reserves or can get somebody to put up the equity side, the bank will fund 60, 70, maybe as much as 80%. They won't fund the whole thing, but they'll fund a chunk of it, and they are available there. And most importantly, at this stage, the bond market becomes relevant. So most of the news and most of the exhibitors who are providing financing in the exhibit hall are bond brokers or bond transactions. But only 12% of the charter schools in the country have ever accessed a bond. And that, by the way, is way up from where it was as people get more comfortable. But this is long-term paper, 30-year financing. It's a loan. And that is available to mature large schools. The reason it's not really available at under 10 million, and people will say, oh, we'll do it at 7 or we'll do it, is because the transaction costs and complexity associated with a bond, it takes a long time to do one. There are 4 different parties. There are lawyers representing 4 different parties. To get it tax exempt or backed by other state programs, it's very complicated. There is a lot of money that goes into the transaction. So if you were doing a $7 million project for your building, you might actually be doing a $9 million financing if you're doing a bond. And at smaller levels, that doesn't really make sense. If you're doing a $50 million financing, spreading a couple $1 million over the transaction isn't nearly as big a deal. It doesn't affect things. You can access then potentially lower rates. In bond financing or any kind of loan program, you're also paying back the principal. Whereas in a lease program, you are just paying the rent. You are not owning the building, and therefore you're not paying back principal. And so those are all things to think about when you're looking at your annual payments. In the upper left-hand quadrant, those things that are large transactions, but still early stage schools, again, developers and the long-term lease option is now available. And down in the lower right quadrant, those are more mature schools, but smaller. The reason you don't see the bond transaction I just talked about, in fact, it's more common to find bank financing in here because local community banks and credit unions can't really fund $30 million transaction, but they can do a $2 to $3 million transaction, and they may have an interest in supporting your school because it's part of the community. So those are all things to think about, and we tried to frame this in a way that you can kind of pick out where you are on the chart and think about what the options are. Kevin mentioned earlier the things that CSC or Charter School Capital does. We actually have our one organization, there are others now, who have dedicated money flowing into the charter school space from traditional real estate investors in those funds. They typically prefer to have something in a lease program, but you have options to buy it if you want. And really the lease versus loan program is just about what are the total dollars I'm paying each year to actually have my school operate in a particular location. It doesn't really matter if it's interest and principal or it's rent. In the end, you don't own it in a loan for 30 years anyway. So by the time you get 30 years out, you're usually refinancing in any case. So principal and interest become just the ongoing costs you have to pay for the facility. And frankly, it is very different, the decision about whether or not to invest in real estate and own, than it is the thing that charter schools are trying to do, which is control your own space. Any way you can accomplish getting into the facility and control the space so you don't get kicked out, you don't get your rates ratcheted up on you or your costs, like surprisingly at the end of the year such that you lose the facility. That's really what you're trying to accomplish. Whether or not you do it via ownership or some lease structure, in the end, is a very different decision. And that's a decision, there are investment funds that want to own real estate. Great. That doesn't mean it always goes up or down. But from a school standpoint, you don't really care whether you own it or not, so long as you control it. And usually people have trended towards ownership because it was the only way to access control.
One size fits all does not really work in the charter school arena as much as we'd like to see it simplified like that. Because of the different state nuances, because of the different economies, because of rural and urban variations on costs of real estate. Another thing, if you've seen one deal, you've seen one deal, because it seems like they vary significantly from one to another. We've seen deals that we tied up a school on 15 acres that was 45,000 square feet, beautiful little school for $600,000 that we were able to acquire the entire facility. And obviously that was a steal of a deal for a group of, and then on the other flip side in Colorado, we just paid $4 million for a piece of property to start construction, which is going to be, a $17, $18 million project for a startup school. So it is, it's as varied as the market. It's as varied as the state laws in each of the different states, and so it takes a little bit of finesse. It takes a little bit of work to try to understand what the school can afford. And boy, the lower you can spend on facilities, the better. When I say 20%, I'm not saying that that's where you ought to be targeting. I'm saying that that's the max that you ought to be targeting. And if there's any way to bring those costs down, that we ought to be looking to do that, because the more you can keep in the school, the stronger the school will be. But again, there are places where it's really hard. For example, San Francisco, you could not do a charter school in San Francisco and find real estate that would allow you to, in fact, probably would take your entire budget. And so there are certain areas where it just does not work, and would be happy, any developer would be happy to help you determine what the feasibility of a school would be in different markets.
You guys want to add something before we go to talk about different
landlords are starting to warm up to charter schools. I mean, there was a lot of pushback a few years ago, but it seems like they're starting to get their head around it. And like, oh, this is government credit tenant, you know, and I'm kind of here looking at regional mom and pops, and I can stabilize my asset with a school. It's just getting their head around the TI and the funding and when that gets allocated. But if you have a representation from a broker, they're going to give you market conditions. They're going to let you know what typical concessions you can get, free rent. Is there a TI allowance built into the asking rate? A lot of developers have that already built into their asking rate. So have a broker, have representation, so you can get a market deal. But as Mike said, it's a form and function of the deal. Every market's different. There's different pressures, different rents in every submarket across the country. But by and large, landlords are now more pro-charter than they've ever been. So going out there and looking for real estate, assuming you're not in a core market where you're 2% vacancy and it's $5 triple net for your rent, there should be more options for you in your markets. And as Mike said, land's cheap enough in some of the suburban rural markets where you guys can do ground up construction and do it pretty cheap.
If you are in a rural market, I think this is one of the programs that Michelle alluded to. The USDA has rural development funds programs, very low cost loans that can be part of any of the capital stack for an organization if you fit in one of those zip codes. There are CDFIs, community development programs out there that target other subsidized rates for areas that various governments are trying to develop. Those are more urban dollars, but I think depending on where you are, there may be subsidies available that make sense. That said, we've tried to simplify it again, just as the previous chart kind of tried to simplify the options for your particular school. This is an attempt in one page to summarize the entire financial capital markets out there. So, yeah. Thinking about financing options, there are a lot of things you'll hear: new market tax credits, EB5. I mentioned, like rural development funds, or all these different. Everybody has like some code name for something, but really, if you think about the framework for options out there, I think it's okay to try to simplify it into these 4 columns that we put out there. If you look across the top, there are 4 framework options listed. Cash, which would be I fund 100% of it with just cash. You just have reserves sitting around. You have a donor benefactor, can fund the whole thing, that whole, $8 million project we talked about. And since I see a lot of laughter, I now recognize that those of you who are charter leaders, you all have one of those benefactors, and so that's great. The rest of the chart is not relevant for you then. If you're one of the few people in a room who don't have all the cash just sitting around, these other things become a little more relevant. And the 3 options are bank financing, the bond market, and long-term lease. We mentioned short-term leases and things like that, but that doesn't really control your facility over the long haul. So these are looking at long-term programs where you get total control over your space that you want to be in. Down the left side, we listed off on the rows really 6 different factors to compare across these programs. One is how much money do you need upfront to close if you're looking at, to fund and get into the program if you're looking at these options. The second being the annual cost ongoing of funding the space or payments. Third, the underwriting criteria, how do you qualify? Fourth, the security interest, what collateral do you have to put up or have available ongoing? And last, the growth options that are available to you if you're using one of these programs, because they vary. There are other considerations listed at the bottom of the catch-all to say, and some other stuff applies to each program. That said, we've used as an example here a $7 million transaction, which you remember from the previous discussion is right there at that kind of break point in the middle. It's really a little too small, and but not so small. It's Goldilocks would have said it's just right. So we picked something in the middle. Bank financing, you would need 30 to 40% of it in cash up front, because the bank comes in typically as a senior lender. They don't provide all the capital. It's the cheapest way to go of all the financing, but the reason it's the cheapest way to go is they're not giving you as much money. So whatever the rate is, however cheap it is or expensive, you're not borrowing as much, so you don't have as much in terms of payments. That's why when you look at the next line, $350,000 to $700,000 a year, the bank option is the cheapest. The bond market provides 100% of the money. It covers everything. It covers the building, all the financing, and of course, all the transaction costs associated with it. That's built in. And if you look at those payments, again, for a $7 million program, you end up in the $600,000 to $800,000 range per year, but you need $200,000 to $500,000 upfront to close. The reason for that is there's some spending you have to do, whether it's getting a rating in advance or architectural plans or designs or other things that you have to build in before you even know if you're getting the financing. So there's some expense or investment you have to make, and it might not be due until the bond funds, but if the bond doesn't fund, you still owe it. So it's upfront cash that's usually required. And then the last program, the long-term lease. Long-term lease also provides 100% financing to the school typically. It is the lowest cost upfront because you heard Mike talk about he isn't even charging anything, and he's a developer doing a lot of work up front. For other investors, the building is kind of sitting there, the transaction costs are relatively low. And one thing that the lease program is not doing that a bond program is in the bond program, they say, yeah, this looks good, I know a guy. Then you have to turn around and you go out and you ask and you pitch a big package on the school to pitch investors. And maybe investors that have funded a lot of charter schools in the past, so you have high likelihood of getting it funded. That's different than a lease program where typically you're talking to the party who is actually putting the money in anyway, so you're kind of already approved. As a result, there are a whole bunch of transactional elements that aren't resident in a lease that makes it less expensive up front. The rates overall may not be less expensive, but really you can see how things compare in annual cost given what the average market rates are. From an underwriting standpoint, there are some differences listed. The banks usually are the most conservative. They really want, a charter to have been renewed, a minimum of 5 years. The bond market used to be like that. It's beginning to come in. Sometimes they'll fund schools after only 3 years. They would still like to see a charter already renewed, but those are the constraints there. And there you have other issues around the debt service coverage, the surplus or profitability of your organization. Banks really do care a lot about that. The bond market also cares a lot about that. And in the bond market, you may or may not need or want a rating. Sometimes you can't even get one, but if you did, it will make the money cheaper for your organization. A lease program typically doesn't really have a minimum. You have unique landlords out there or pools of capital that are just investing in charter schools, and they are willing to fund schools earlier. Not necessarily year zero schools like Mike, he's crazy, but other schools, other funding sources that are now comfortable with charter schools will say, hey, you're in year 1 or 2 of your program, but you already have the facility. We'll give you a long-term lease. You can be in there for 20 or 40 years or whatever. There are investors now who are interested in doing that. And as a result, they have lower minimums in terms of your maturity. Academic success is a little more flexible, and generally the program itself is more flexible. I won't spend a lot of time going through the other elements on here, except to say that in the bond market, one of the constraints around growth options are, if you think about it, if you're not done growing whenever this financing or this first facility is done, you're thinking, well, when I want to expand, where am I going to get the rest of the money? If you're going to a bank, they have to go back to the credit committee. They gave you $2.5 million the first time. Now you come back and say, hey, I want to refi my loan, and now I need $4 million because I want to expand. Depending on what things look like in the market at that time or that bank that you were dealing with, may be a very different situation than it was when you started. And that could constrain your growth options. In the bond market, bond investors don't really like to do a transaction and just be in it for 2 years and then start all over. As a result, there are typically covenants now in traditional bond programs that will have commonly a 10-year lockout where you have to stay in the bond and in that facility for at least 10 years before you're allowed to refi. I'm not saying that every bond transaction is the same or that they all have 10-year lockouts. Some do, some might be 5 years, but generally the bond investors aren't looking to do a 15-minute transaction. They want to receive the income stream associated with the bond long term. That constrains your options.
We've used every one of these and multiple others, and some of them can be pretty sophisticated deals. And so when we're talking about these, and if you're a bond person, certainly don't want to offend or have everything lumped into one neatly packaged deal, because all of the things can change and there's nuances. But generally speaking, cash is not much of an option. We've done that in the past when we've rolled money from one school to another, and it's nice and it works, but leverage is always nice, particularly if you've got a bank that you can work with, and with today's rates, it makes sense to have some leverage into the deal. Bank deals, if you're well seasoned and if you have the reserves, are great deals. You can usually make those work well, and if you've got the reserves, if you've got the track record, and you've got the history, and you've got a workable bank, that is a great option for you, and they're usually pretty flexible, especially if they're a regional or local bank that you're doing your banking with, and you've got a good relationship. Adding facility space and things like that in the future is usually possible and a great place to be. You usually don't start out there. That usually comes after several years of operation and very efficiently managing the cash flow and putting some money away and getting to a point where you're able to be a very reputable and very seasoned operator. Bonds usually, again, are not available in the first year or two of operations. And as Stuart mentioned, it's a great vehicle if you're seasoned and if you're finished growing. It is difficult to do one tranche and then have a parity clause in there that allows them to sell additional bonds and to deal with that transaction over the long haul. So the hard part there is being able to continue to grow and meet your facility needs if you're in a bond deal already. So you really need to think about where you're going before you get into a bond deal, because if you're not careful, it can constrain your growth. Usually up front, the easiest and most versatile way of financing schools is through a lease option with purchase options in the back end where you can take advantage of some of these other opportunities. Now, that may not fit everyone either, but it seems to be the most versatile way to start out in the marketplace. At least that's been our experience.
Michelle, you mentioned at one of the sessions we've done previously some work that was done in Colorado or someplace. You commented on it.
Yeah, California partnered with the Colorado Facilities Initiative a couple years ago to survey our over 1,200 charter schools and their cost of facilities. So tying this back to kind of the cost that comes out of your pocket for each of these options, what we found in California is bonds, which are increasingly popular for our more mature and larger organizations, are the most expensive. They're about 30% actually. Sometimes that's a high level, but we have found up to 30% of your general operating fund for a bond deal. Leases are definitely by far the most affordable option, except for we do have a program in California that offers pretty much a free facility, but it's not a great option. Leases are more like 8 to 12% of your general operating funds. So we have about 30% of our schools in leases due to that more the flexibility it offers and the more reasonable cost.
So we tried to, by the way, as I look around the room, I see friends of ours, and they are friends. We're bond providers. If it sounds like we're bashing on them, I want to be clear, we're not. It actually is exactly what it looked like on that chart earlier. More mature, large transaction, very efficient way to go. Less mature, small transaction, not as efficient. That doesn't mean all the other programs, they're all fraught with their own challenges. We tried to summarize two types of transactions here. You'll see how this changes. So this is a $5 million project, and red, difficult or bad relative to the other options. Green, good or easy. Yellow, someplace in the middle. So if you look across the 4 programs, obviously the reason cash is red is because cash needed is the biggest challenge, and since we don't have it, not really an option. But looking at the other 3, you see a lot of red on the bonds for annual cost, underwriting requirements because it would be hard to get approved, security interest is constrained, and growth options. But that's for a $5 million project. And then the lease or bank options for a smaller project tend to be more compelling or more available. If you then switch over and look at the same analysis on a $20 million project, you see that the bond ends up being still no cash required or very little required up front. The annual cost is most inexpensive because of the larger transaction. The underwriting criteria for a bond are still typically higher than most. The reason the bank, you can see red on the underwriting, is it's the hardest one to get approved for generally for really all options. The local banks tend to be the most conservative, but you can see the rest. And growth options on a bond, the reason it went from red on the small transaction to yellow on a larger transaction is, frankly, if you did a $100 million transaction in a bond transaction and you came up 5 years into your 10-year lockout and said, hey, we'd really like to refi and do it all over again, the bond guys can place it again. So they're going to be perfectly fine, usually, with modifying that covenant and going back out. Now, you're going to incur all the same costs all over again, but you'll have more flexibility because size does, in fact, matter in the bond market. I think that's just a simplistic way to think about some of the programs and comparing them. And I know there was a lot of detail on some of the previous charts, but I do want to use Kevin.
It's all going to back into what makes sense for your school. I mean, if you look at the bank, that's a lot of liquidity for you, 35-40% down, but it's cheap money. So if you guys have the reserves, if it makes sense, the bank's going to be better for you long term from an operation cost standpoint. But if you guys want to take on that, hey, bring in a developer, bring in somebody that's going to shoulder the burden, so to speak, on the front end cost. That's another avenue. It might be 9, 10, 11% versus 5 or 6%, but you keep your liquidity so you can grow your school. So it just kind of what makes sense for you at the end of the day, from a liquidity standpoint, cost of capital, you have to model that individually for yourselves.
Just to give a little bit more love to the bond market people, there are some states that have fantastic programs that do help and do some credit enhancement. In California right now, we're actually working on potentially starting a program, trying to get it through the legislature. But that would basically it would help schools in the bond market. It would give them kind of a guarantee at the state level that when they went out to the bond market, it would increase their credit rating. And so other states, we modeled it after Colorado, and other states have similar programs.
By the way, the people we said we're referring to, I'm looking at the back. It's not like they're shaking their head no when we're saying this. And one of the reasons is if you go up and say, hey, I have a $3 million project, can I work with you on the bond? The answer is they'll be really polite, but they don't really want to because it's too small. So that said, we're going to look now at funding approval and execution. The approval side, just qualifying for any financing, we want to touch on a little bit. In terms of passing whatever underwriting test you face, whether it's a bond or the banks or some lease or some landlord or investor that's going to do things, if you need approval for somebody else's money, you're generally looking at these 4 core issues every time. Everybody wants to know what's going on with your enrollment. If you think about it, from a financial standpoint, the number of students you're serving, the stability of that enrollment, or increasing nature of that enrollment is what the financial markets care about. That's consistent with your mission anyway. You're trying to serve as many kids as you can in a specialized and quality manner. That's what the financial markets are looking for, and they want indications of the fact that students will keep coming so that you can keep paying your debt service or lease. The other thing is examples of things that provide that are your expanding grades, you have waiting lists, or any other things that indicate, hey, demand for my school is really strong. Everybody wants to go here.
When we're looking at underwriting enrollment. I mean, usually enrollment has deep implications of every other component. If you've got good enrollment and it continues to stay strong, it means you're doing something right in the educational process. It means that you're meeting the parent needs. You're doing everything right, because enrollment is what really drives dollars. It's what drives sustainability. It's what we look at. Everything else is kind of secondary to enrollment, because everything's tied to enrollment. So we want to see schools that have excitement in the community. We want to see waitlets. We want to see people wanting to get into the school. And, grades we're concerned about. We're concerned about financials, but all of those things can be handled much easier than enrollment. If you've got that, then you've got something that we can work with.
You got love, you got everything. And the other three things, school leadership and history. This is an indication that your organization knows what they're doing, is going to be able to repeat that going forward. Again, it doesn't matter if you're talking to a developer or a bank, whether you're 10 years in or 10 weeks in. The fact is that people care about these things. But school leadership and history, you can present a lot of different ways. It could be about the individuals. It could be about the brand and the program. That's something people care about. How repeatable and sustainable is it? The numbers have to pencil. All these things we just talked about on the finance side and the math, somebody's going to run the numbers. They need to make sure you can afford to pay whatever it is going to be paid, and that the rest of your program can still be supported to ensure that you have enrollment. And then the last issue, governance issues. People do look to make sure that your board really is independent, that they are capable individuals. They also want to talk to authorizers and make sure you're likely to be renewed. If somebody's investing in the space you're going to be in, they're really making a long-term investment and commitment to the school. And so renewal likelihood and things like that are big issues. And they do look into that, and they will diligence those things. So these are 4 core categories to think about. Any other things you guys want to say about this before we?
How much time have we got?
The session's supposed to end at 12:30. It's an hour and 15 minutes. Is that right? Okay, everybody's not here. All right, so we're almost done, and then we'll open it up for additional questions if you have. So we've got a minute.
I think that all of these are critical, but I think you've got them in the right order. I think enrollment is number 1.
And 2 and 3. You said.
Yeah.
All right.
Roger can go ahead. I'm sorry. For numbers have to pencil. One kind of square footage that I always use is for urban schools. I do 60 square feet per student, and then for suburban markets, I do 75 square feet per student. That way, you're within your ratios. So that's important as you're kind of looking at. Hey, we have 600 kids. What size of a school are we looking for? Just multiply that by 60 square feet, or 75 if you want to pad it. That's a good indication of the right fit for your enrollment.
And for a startup school or even for a remodeled school, those numbers work. It's interesting though, again, every school is different. We did one in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and bought a 330,000 square foot mall, and they put 600 kids in it the first year, 1,200 kids the next year, but if you do the math, there's a couple hundred square foot per kid. And so it really depends what you're able to find in the marketplace. There are deals out there. There are ways to leverage the desirability of a school. But again, every deal kind of looks different based on the funding models, based on the demographics of the area, based on what's available in the area. And that's what makes it so fun for us. We get involved in so many different kinds of facilities, and we're able to adapt those to the needs of the school, and it makes the schools unique, and it really is an enjoyable market.
I think the 60 to 75 square foot per student is a good metric. Mike mentioned some of the caveats around that. I would add one other, which is if you're a blended learning model or online program or anything like that, obviously, again, because the space is serving some other purpose, it doesn't have to house kids from 8 to 3 or all day long. So you can actually be on the lower square foot per student. We funded some programs across the country that will run 3 shifts a day. So, like they have a school running in normal operating hours. There's also an evening program, a very things, and they're funding some challenged aspects of the population that maybe the traditional districts can't serve, because you've got, working high school kids or teenage moms or anything like that, where they just can't go to the normal program because they have a job during the day. That would allow you to actually have, more students in the same square footage, because they're not actually there all at the same time. I'm just going to show this and not spend time on it and say this. The execution of creating and building the space is really hard. There's a lot of planning that has to occur, and you can assume that it's not, hey, we should move next week. It's, hey, we should move 2 years from now. It really takes a while. There's a lot of strategy and thought that has to go into where you're going to be located. And frankly, that's one of the biggest issues with what you're doing and how you select a site. Early on, be in the locale that you want to operate in long term. And if you could be on the same plot of land the whole time, that's good too. And then expand as you go. But planning is a big issue, not just because of the financial issues, but the entire program. And funding, again, we talked about all the different options, but it doesn't take 15 minutes to get financing either. The acquisition of the site, picking out whether it even has the right parameters, or you can get local zoning or whatever, all kinds of issues about just acquiring the land, even if there's no building on it. And if there is a building on it, it may not be for the use, you may have to qualify it as a school. Design and build. The design, Mike mentioned some of the ranges of how you can adjust the cost, depending on what you're building in the program or how you approach it, value engineering, that's a big issue. And the build-out process itself is, again, huge teams, all kinds of contractors, people crawling all over the place. One thing that's not mentioned in here is the burden on your faculty and staff when you're engaged in any kind of build-out, move, or transition. It is massive. So all I'd say about this is, like those little warning labels on action movies that say, professional stuntman, don't try this at home. I would say, doing these things you can do on your own. But if you're probably not focused on educating kids, which is actually the bulk of what your organization should be and is dedicated to. And there are experts out here who can do all of these things, and most of them do it for no cost up front. They just end up building it into the successful program in the back end.
I agree with what you say there. There's all kinds of factors to deal with, and probably traffic has been one of the most difficult in most states. Are becoming more and more sophisticated and trying to offload more and more of the burden of their infrastructure on schools and other, even other commercial ventures. And so you find the DOTs of the world that are looking for improvements surrounding facilities, and that can be very costly and can be very difficult and time consuming. We've had some real issues in some states based on their desire to improve infrastructure on the backs of you guys. So those are things that need to be taken into consideration as you look at facilities and how you're going to structure facilities in long term. It's as open and as variable as the financing and everything else. When you start into it, you may start out in some modular facilities and then grow the facility from there. You may start in a brand new facility depending on enrollment demands or what the cost of facilities are. But again, every school is going to be specific as we look at what you can afford and try to back in what you can afford to what we can provide and what the options are in the marketplace.
I think Stuart hit the nail on the head with 2 years to get ahead of it. If you have to go to a site and get a conditional use permit, that can take 6 months. Landlord's not going to do any tenant improvements, any sort of architectural drawings until you have that stuff already ahead of time. So you got to get ahead of it at least 12 months, ideally 12 to 18 months, just so you have enough time to do any sort of scope of work feasibility studies, traffic impact studies. I mean, that's huge. And it's costly. So you guys can set aside some of these prices. It can be $5,000 for a CUP. It can be $5,000 for a traffic study. So have some of that cash on hand if you don't plan right. and try and get ahead of that from a planning standpoint and have some of those reserves set away for feasibility studies when you're looking into these sites because it's getting timely and it's getting cost prohibitive. And again, landlords aren't going to start TIs until you have some sort of wink and a nod from the zoning department that they're going to allow a school at that site.
I want to. We're going to take additional questions actually now, but I did want to let everybody know, just a reminder of the contact info. And because some people may be transitioning to the next session, before we roll into questions, a couple of announcements. First, I mentioned earlier that it's available, the presentation at charterschoolcapital.org/national. Contact info is here. You'll actually, you can access it at our website if you need to, but the material's there. The second thing is I wanted to thank the panelists. I think you probably understand why I have so much respect for my fellow panelists. They really are experts in leading the country in terms of support for charter schools. So if we can thank everybody. I think the National Alliance has asked everybody to fill out surveys. I don't know where they are. Fill them out, say everything's great. As to the other stuff, we'll absolutely take questions now, and I think there's another 5 minutes before the session's supposed to end, but I did want to, because you may be going to like Virginia for your next session. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to ask the panel, what are the 3 things that we should not do?
Okay. What are the 3 things we should not do?
Okay. You told us what should we do?
Well, it kind of depends again who you are and what your school's condition is. But if you're a new charter school, you should not run out and sign an agreement with an architect to design a building for you. Typically, that's premature. Typically, that puts a lot of financial stress on your school. And if you don't have the funds to pay for it, that's probably not the best thing to do. Typically, you should not load your complete board with just educators. You need to have a good mix of expertise on the board. You got to be looking for legal. You got to be looking for marketing. You got to be looking for accounting. You got to be looking for marketing and business experience, so that you've got a well-diversified board and not just education. Now, we know it's about education. You got to have that expertise, but we find more often than not that we sit down with the board and they have an extreme amount of educational background and experience and no other expertise, which is very difficult to underwrite when we're looking for a governance board that has a very well diversified portfolio. You have to be careful not to make commitments that you can't keep up front. You got to be looking for experts to help you that have experience in the marketplace so that they can kind of guide you through those. So those would be a couple of suggestions. I'm probably missing some. But
from a lessor or lessee standpoint, do not go directly to a landlord without a broker. They have a sophisticated team. They have attorneys, they have in-house architects, all these people. If you're just going to show up and think you're going to get a market deal without representation, they have no fiduciary obligation to work in your benefit. Right? They're going to try and get the best deal they can. So it's important to have representation either through a broker or through an attorney.
You'll hear from each of us things that fit with our expertise. I would say, don't do any of these things without having the financing lined up at the beginning. It's pretty easy to actually get it lined up, and it still won't be finalized until you have all these other things identified, but you get a pretty good idea of what you can afford and what that project is, and that will help Kevin find you a site that works and help Mike design and build something that fits. All those things fit together. I would say the summary point is I've seen schools try to manage it themselves with the executive director and members of the board, and I would say, please don't do that. It is a massive distraction, and I've watched schools tank the academics and blow up the program while trying to move. program that was going great, all of a sudden the management team is spending all this energy on financing, funding, building out, dealing with the move. You miss the whole point of what you were doing in the first place in your mission. I'd say stay focused on the mission and hire experts to do the other, because frankly, you don't have to pay up front for them usually. They'll do it just as part of the success of the program overall. So if there are any other questions, feel free. If you want to stay, we'll hang out and we'll meet out there. We can talk to people. Feel free to contact us afterwards. I am sensitive to time and I want to get everybody to the next session. Thank you very much.